They thought they could silence him. One commercial break, one apology, and it would all disappear. But when a legend walks away, leaving only stunned silence and open mouths, something shifts. People start talking. They start asking questions. And that's what the elites fear the most. But let's go back to the moment when everything spiraled out of control. The Livewire studios buzzed with a nervous energy, the kind you feel before something big goes down, but no one knew just how big. Camera crews scrambled like overcaffeinated ants, last-minute adjustments were being made to the lighting, and producers whispered urgently into their headsets. The show was about to go live, and in the middle of it all sat Clint Eastwood, a living relic of a time when men didn't need permission to speak their minds. Across from him, Jonathan Mallow, the studio's golden boy, polished suit, million-dollar smile, and the kind of voice that made people trust him, even when he wasn't saying much of anything. He'd done this 1,000 times, smooth, controlled interviews with celebrities who were either too eager to please or too scared to ruffle feathers. But tonight was different. Clint sat there, arms crossed, his face as worn and cracked as the deserts of an old western. The kind of man who had seen things, done things, and had zero interest in pretending otherwise. His eyes, sharp and calculating, swept across the room like he was scanning a battlefield. Mallow, ever the professional, straightened his tie and offered his signature friendly nod, ready to dive into what he assumed would be a lighthearted conversation about Hollywood, filmmaking, and nostalgia for the so-called good old days. Big mistake. Clint exhaled slowly, leaning forward. His voice, deep and weathered, cut through the fake warmth of the studio like a knife through butter. Son, I've seen a lot in my life, but this... His eyes moved from the bright stage lights to the crew, then back to Mallow. This is something else. Mallow blinked, his rehearsed confidence faltering just a bit. What do you mean? Clint tilted his head slightly, like he was debating whether or not the kid in front of him could handle the truth. Then, deciding he didn't particularly care, he continued, This whole place, this industry, a bunch of people sitting on gold-plated thrones, telling everyone else how they should live, telling the guy who works 16 hours a day that it's his fault he can't afford to send his kid to college. A flicker of tension shot through Mallow's face. He was still smiling, but it wasn't reaching his eyes. Well, Clint, he said, shifting in his seat, I think what you're referring to is a broader discussion about economic... Clint held up a hand. Stop. And just like that, the air in the room changed. You ever talk to a guy who works with his hands for a living? Clint's voice was low, steady. Someone who doesn't get million-dollar checks for reading words someone else wrote? Someone who doesn't spend their weekends at gala events, clinking glasses with people who wouldn't last a day outside their gated communities? Mallow opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I'll tell you what happens, Clint continued. You meet a man like that, and you look him in the eye, you'll see something you don't see in Hollywood. Mallow finally found his voice. And what's that? Clint's gaze was cold. Honesty. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable kind. It was heavy, suffocating. The kind that made producers in the control room start sweating. Behind the cameras, studio execs exchanged quick, uneasy glances. This was not the conversation they'd planned. This was not what the teleprompter had lined up. Mallow cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Well, Clint, I think it's important to recognize that many in Hollywood do contribute to social causes. They do. Clint let out a dry chuckle. You serious, kid? Mallow hesitated. When's the last time one of your Hollywood elites gave up a paycheck for their so-called principles? Clint leaned back, eyes locked on the host. When's the last time they turned down a blockbuster deal because they actually believed in what they preach? No answer. Behind Mallow, a producer was making desperate hand gestures, silently urging him to cut to commercial. But Mallow couldn't move. He was stuck in the headlights of something far bigger than him, something raw, something real. Look, he finally stammered, I think we should shift away from politics and focus on... Clint leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was quiet, but it hit like a hammer. Let's not. The room froze. The cameras kept rolling. And for the first time in his career, Jonathan Mallow didn't know what to say. If anyone was mid-sip of their coffee, now would be the time to choke on it. Clint Eastwood, 93 years old, a living legend, a man who had seen Hollywood from its golden age to whatever this mess was now, leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. His eyes, sharp as ever, locked onto the camera with the kind of intensity that could make a grown man rethink his entire life. And then he smirked. Not the friendly, grandpa at a family BBQ kind of smirk. No, this was the I know something you don't, and you're about to find out kind of smirk. The studio had gone dead silent. You could hear the static hum of the stage lights, the subtle shuffling of nervous producers behind the cameras. And then, in that same gravelly, no-nonsense tone, he spoke. You know what's funny? All these so-called justice warriors. They're just puppets on strings. Mallow sat up straighter, alarm bells going off in his head. His training, his years in media, every instinct he had was screaming, control the situation. But Clint raised a hand, slow, deliberate. Let me finish, son. And just like that, the entire room fell into a vacuum of silence. Every intern, every crew member, every high-up executive watching from their private booths, they all knew something was happening here, something raw, something they weren't going to be able to edit out later. Clint leaned back slightly, his gaze sweeping across the studio, as if taking in every single person sitting there, watching, waiting. I grew up in an America where a man was judged by what he did, not by what he said, he continued. I watched guys with empty pockets build fortunes. I saw people work their way up from nothing, scraping, grinding, earning every single thing they had. And now? His expression hardened. Now, we got rich kids preaching about equality while sitting inside mansions built by people they don't even see. A murmur rippled through the studio. You could feel the discomfort in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. Someone behind the cameras was gesturing wildly, signaling to wrap this up, to move on, to do something. But Jonathan Mallow, who had handled tough interviews, who had navigated countless tricky conversations, just sat there, staring, because he knew. If he shut this down, his career would be over before the next commercial break. So instead, he swallowed hard and tried to regain control. Well, Clint, I think there's something to be said for change, for progress. Clint exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound that, in any other setting, might have been mistaken for amusement. Progress? He shook his head, looking directly into the camera now. Hollywood has become a place full of people who are afraid of their own shadows. You know what the real problem is? It's not who has what or who says what. The real problem is fear. Fear is the real sickness eating away at this place. Mallow shifted in his chair. Fear? Clint nodded. Fear of telling the truth. Fear of losing a paycheck. Fear of being called the wrong thing. Everyone here is walking on eggshells, terrified of saying something that might upset the wrong people, and that fear, that's what's killing this town. At this point, you could hear a pen drop. The energy in the room was electric, half shock, half something else, something that felt dangerously close to agreement. Mallow, desperate to steer things back on track, forced a polite chuckle. You're saying that Hollywood? I'm saying, Clint cut in, voice steady, that if I tried to make Dirty Harry today, they wouldn't let me. Because that character? He told the truth. And the truth isn't welcome here anymore. The weight of that sentence hit like a hammer. Silence. Not the awkward, fill-the-gap kind of silence. No, this was the kind of silence that meant everyone was processing. The kind that meant something real had just been said, something that couldn't be unsaid. Clint didn't blink, didn't fidget, just sat there, arms crossed, watching them all absorb it. And then, finally, so tell me, he said, leaning back in his chair, am I the one who's outdated? Or did all of you just get soft? Jonathan Mallow exhaled sharply. He could feel the sweat creeping down the back of his neck. He could see the chaos unfolding just behind the cameras, producers whispering frantically, network executives probably losing their minds in the control room. This interview had officially gone off the rails, and then, like the cherry on top of this absolute disaster of a media moment, the feed cut to commercial. But it was too late. Because out there, in the real world, people were already talking. The second live wire cut to commercial, the studio erupted into chaos. Producers were yelling into headsets, scrambling to figure out how to handle the fallout. Interns rushed between desks, phones ringing non-stop. Executives in their glass offices watched the disaster unfold in real time, their carefully constructed PR plans crumbling by the second. But none of it mattered, because outside that studio, the internet had already detonated. Within minutes, headlines flooded every major news feed. Clint Eastwood just took a flamethrower to Hollywood live. Eastwood drops truth bombs, studio panics. Legend calls out elites. Mic drop heard around the world. Social media turned into a wildfire. Clips of the interview spread at an unstoppable rate. People clipped every single moment. Clint's brutal one-liners, Mallow's desperate attempts to regain control. The moment the entire studio realized they had lost the narrative, and then came the memes. A still shot of Clint leaning forward, captioned, "The moment Hollywood knew it was in trouble." A looping clip of Mallow shifting uncomfortably in his chair, "When your guest goes off script and the truth hurts." A black and white image of Clint in his prime, overlaid with his words, "If I made Dirty Harry today, they wouldn't let me." And then came the real problem for Hollywood. People weren't just watching, they were asking questions. Wait, is he wrong? Why does the truth make people so uncomfortable? How come nobody in Hollywood ever talks like this? If the interview wasn't a big deal, why are they trying so hard to bury it? That was the part that terrified the industry the most. This conversation was no longer in their hands. By the time Livewire returned from the commercial break, Clint was gone. The chair where he had sat just minutes ago, empty. Instead, Jonathan Mallow sat alone, gripping the edges of his desk like a man who had just survived a disaster. His face was pale, his perfectly styled hair slightly out of place. For a moment, he just stared at the camera, like his brain was still buffering, still processing what had just happened. Then, he swallowed hard and forced a smile. "Well, that was certainly an unexpected conversation," he said, his voice slightly strained. "We'd like to remind our viewers that the opinions expressed, but it didn't matter, because nobody was buying it. Behind the scenes, Hollywood's damage control machine kicked into overdrive. Do not cover the Eastwood story. Flood the news cycle with other trending topics. Push positive headlines on major networks." Every major outlet got the same memo. Bury it, spin it, make it disappear. Some outlets tried to downplay the whole thing. Clint Eastwood's outdated views stir controversy. Hollywood reacts to shocking Eastwood interview. Others went into full damage control mode. Livewire apologizes for unscripted remarks. And then came the predictable think pieces. Should we still listen to Clint Eastwood in 2025? The generational divide in Hollywood. But here's the thing. It wasn't working, because every time they tried to suppress the conversation, it just got louder. The problem with trying to control a wildfire, it doesn't listen. Within hours, major influencers and independent media outlets started weighing in. Say what you want, but he didn't lie. This interview was a wake-up call. Funny how the media is panicking right now. And then something happened that Hollywood wasn't ready for. The conversation stopped being about Clint. It became about everything he called out. People started sharing their own stories. Workers, veterans, everyday Americans. My father worked 50 years in construction, never took a dime from anyone. He told me the same thing Eastwood just said. I used to believe in Hollywood until I saw how fake it really is. The moment you stop playing by their script, they try to erase you. That was when the industry really started to panic, because this wasn't just about a viral interview anymore. This was about people waking up. Within a few hours, some of the biggest media personalities in the country were forced to acknowledge the interview. Some tried to dismiss it, others tried to mock it. But no matter what they did, one thing was clear. Nobody could ignore it. By the end of the day, Clint's name was the #1 trending topic across every platform. Old clips of him speaking out in past interviews resurfaced. His most famous quotes about hard work, accountability, and the Hollywood machine were reposted by millions. The more they tried to control the damage, the bigger it got. And as one journalist put it in a late-night segment, it seems like Clint Eastwood did what no one else in Hollywood was willing to do. He said what a lot of people were already thinking. And somewhere out there, away from the noise, away from the headlines, Clint Eastwood probably just shook his head and smiled, because, as he once said, If you start a war, be ready to finish it.